to be entitled. Doesn't mean that you owe it to me, or that you should give it to me, or because my last name is Pitcairn that I deserve this unequivocally. I don't believe that.
Thank you so much for tuning into Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. I'm your host, Christian D. Evans. Today we have the next generation, fourth generation family office member. Now, most of you guys are going out there and maybe you've come from a family that has a really solid name like the Rothschilds or Rockefeller, or a name that you want to build into legacy. And you say, how do you establish that? How do you want to be the first generation, but then how do you make sure you're thinking about the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth generation, individuals that you don't even meet? Well, that's the reason why I have this next guest on. He comes from an incredible family, but much more, he comes in a humble way and a steward responsibility in the way he thinks about stewarding his wealth and his family's wealth to be able to make sure that obviously carries to the next generation. Now, I am so excited about having him on. Obviously, he has extensive experience, not only obviously in the investing thesis and the investing world, but also in the way he thinks about obviously developing an incredible community and ecosystem and relationships with his family members. Please welcome my next guest, a fourth generation family member of the chair of the Pitcairn Family Council, board of directors and governance chair, and co-trustee of the Pitcairn Family Office. Please welcome my next guest, the one and only Andrew Pitcairn. How you doing today, Andrew?
Christian, you're too kind, and that was a mouthful, I'll tell you. I know we should have just condensed it down to Andrew Pitcairn, but I appreciate you adding all those actions in there.
Well, Andrew, I really appreciate you coming on our podcast and talking about kind of, the way you think about it. We talked a little bit offline about you knew right off the bat, you saw your name on different buildings, and you knew you came from a family that was just different. And I wanted to talk, because obviously that was an evolution to now how you think about the responsibility and the stewardship. And I use those words intentionally because that's how you look at the wealth and the responsibility you have. But I want to talk, before we dive into all that fun stuff, Andrew, I really want to talk about your young childhood, how you knew you were part of a family, but you didn't know exactly how that all evolved. Help us understand kind of what you saw and what was that experience like, coming from a very well-known family.
Sure. No, I'm happy to. And maybe for a little context, I'll just kind of go back into the beginning of our family evolution, if you will, to give you guys some context on where we've come from. My great-grandfather, John Pitcairn, was an immigrant from Scotland back in 1846. And he was an extremely entrepreneurial young man. At the age of 14, dropped out of school and decided to go work for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Quickly worked his way up on the railroad, doing different jobs, and then transitioned into oil and gas. He worked and represented independent oil and gas. John D. obviously represented Standard Oil and Gas. And after that, the wealth creation of my family was that John Pitcairn founded and launched Pittsburgh Plate Glass in 1883. So by the 1900s, Pittsburgh Plate Glass was manufacturing about 70% of all plate glass in the United States. When I say plate glass, think about flat glass in buildings, car windows, anything flat back then. So it was a tremendous success for the family at that stage. And then he had three sons, one of which was my grandfather. They all inherited his estate when he died in 1916. And then they all had their own professions, their own careers, their own hobbies, decided to pool their wealth together and their advisors under one roof, and in 1923 formed what you would call today to be a family office. I think one of the things that I want to touch on before we go further is there's a town outside Philadelphia that my great-grandfather John Pitcairn founded and really built up. It's called Bryn Athyn, 2 words, Bryn Athyn. And it means in Welsh, the hill of integrity. And he founded this town, and he built the family estates, and he built the cathedral, all in an effort to build the faith. He was a strong advocate of the Swedenborgian faith, which is a branch of Christianity. And so growing up in this small town, 30 minutes northeast of Center City, Philadelphia, that no one's ever heard of. So when people say to me, where did you grow up? I say, well, I grew up in a town called Bryn Athyn. I went to school in a town called Bryn Athyn, and no one's ever heard of it. But for us, being the family that we are, we ended up seeing, our names on different buildings, you grow up realizing at a young age there's something that maybe is just a little bit different. And I think that is what you're really talking about, Christian. It is, what is it early on that you instill some sort of knowledge about your family, some appreciation about your family legacy, and some real appreciation about family values and stewardship as we navigate moving forward into adulthood. So I'll pause there.
Well, you're exactly right, and there are numerous examples, even from the Forbes family, where the kids of the Forbes family didn't realize that their family was of wealth until he was featured in a magazine or this or that. Same thing with Warren Buffett's children. There's been numerous stories where, I didn't know my dad was that wealthy until all of a sudden certain things were happening. And so, when you were younger, you said you started seeing your last name on these buildings, and then there was something that had to click, and then I'm just curious. Was it at that point where you started not only realizing you have to understand that obviously you come from wealth, and then with that comes obviously responsibility, like that whole saying comes with, but also the way you approach it is very humbling, and I think it's really awesome, the alignment of your stewardship. It's not your money, but it's your family's money, and being able to obviously steward that correctly for the next generation and so forth. So at what point in your life, Andrew, did those values or that ethos kind of become established? Was that when you were younger and when you started realizing that, or was that an evolution? What did that look like?
I think Christian, those are great questions, and I think it's probably a combination of all of the above. I mean, I think that some people, it's just maybe innate. You're born with this sense of, well, I'm part of something that's bigger, that's beyond me, that a purpose that that I'm here to help maybe fulfill in myself and be of service to others. That's something that we're taught. But I think some people are born with that, and I think for other people, it's an evolution. You start to live within the family, and you start to the family becomes part of your identity. And I think some values and some sense of stewardship and responsibility is inevitably taught to you along the way. So I think it's a combination of things. I think for me, it was certainly a combination. At a younger age, and I mean early teens, I recognized from what I said, seeing our name in different places, that there was something different about us, but I didn't really know what it was. And then I think in any small community, you start to hear rumors and people talk. And when I say it's a small community, I mean it's 3 square miles and a handful of thousand of people. This is not a big city. This is a small community. Everyone knows each other. Everyone goes to the same school. Everyone goes to church on Sundays. And so you start to hear rumors. And then, as a teenager, you ask your parents but certain things. And then, some parents want to have very, very very in-depth conversations with you. Some parents want to have more age-appropriate conversations with you. Some parents say, I'm not going to talk to you about any of this for another 10 years. So for me, I was blessed to have a combination of the above, and just always had this sense that, although I wasn't quite sure of all the nuances of our family, I knew that there was something there. I knew that there was some wealth there, that there was some planning that had been done by my forefathers, my grandfather, great-grandfather, grandmother, great-grandmother. And really, I think to your point, a growing sense of responsibility towards representing not just myself individually, but that I carry the last name and I represent the family.
So let's talk a little bit about this because, again, I want to dive into the way you think about this and that stewardship. Now, with this evolution of your own journey throughout this process, what do you feel like your family has done correctly that help facilitate maybe the right systems or the right boundaries? And I'm not talking really about the financial vehicles per se, but really about building the right community, like you mentioned, the communication within the family, so that you guys are all aligned and realizing, okay, this is bigger than all of us. We're part of something bigger. Sharing those values, sharing maybe even the Christian beliefs as well. Whatever it was that kind of helped facilitate that positive synergistic relationship that helped facilitate the continued wealth generation.
Sure. Well, Christian, I think a lot of that is hinged on our family office. Our family office as kind of the vehicle for stewardship, which started off as many other families do, started off really as, as investments and thinking about technical things that families need, investments in estate planning and taxes and all of those things. That quickly, as our family grew, morphed into more of a, what does it really take to be sustainable from generation to generation? So if people think, I view sustainability as year after year, or I view success as year over year. We view it as generation over generation. What's your 50-year plan, your 100-year plan? And I think to really do that, you have to look at more than just investments and just those things that I call the technical side of things. I think you really have to look at the family dynamic. How are you addressing family needs and family concerns and family growth, and how are you educating the next generation and preparing them to not only be responsible stewards of wealth, but to be wealth creators, to be appreciative, and to realize that you have a greater good to give back to society and be a productive individual in life. And I think that can be really challenging for families of wealth. And for us, that really came from our family office. Our family office was and is a cornerstone of where the family turned for a lot of these solutions. Again, not just for the family office helping us think it through. Let's make sure that we steward your wealth correctly, but also let's make sure that we figure out ways to have productive decision making, that we have vehicles for philanthropic giving, that we have events for the family members to be educated about. Again, what does it mean to give back to society and be a productive individual and find purpose within oneself? I think that's a big piece that's missed when it comes to, I think really, you don't even have to put this in the bucket of wealth. I think that we have a responsibility as human beings, as stewards of just humanity, to be of service to each other and to make sure that we prop each other up and that we get the best out of, we give the best from ourselves, we expect the best out of each other, and that we help people to the best that we can be the best person they can be. So our family office did a lot of that. I know that was a mouthful, so I want to just pause for a minute and let you jump in there with any more questions.
No, you're bringing up some really good points, and I want to talk a little bit and get a little personal with your story, Andrew, and your journey.
Sure.
Did you ever have like that imposter syndrome where, okay, hey, you got a family and they've been able to achieve great heights, and it's almost like you have to outshine and do something bigger because you have to carry on the name, right? And you got shoes to fill, right? All those things, those self-image, that identity, your own kind of thing. So how did you have, because like you mentioned, you said that you obviously are thinking generation over generation, but you also want to make sure you're a good steward in that. So it's like, how do you find your own path and not have that quote unquote imposter syndrome that others may or may not have? So how did you find your own identity, Andrew, and help obviously facilitate not only your identity but others in your family as well, so they're all separate but also unique? It's like a body, right? The left arm is different than the right arm, but it's all very important in the ecosystem of the body.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I appreciate you asking that. And I think if I remember early on in my life, and maybe others feel this way too. I know I've talked to other people in my family and other people in other legacy families. I think it's really difficult at an early age to see yourself outside of the family system, especially if you carry a last name, right? So I had a big identity of, I'm a Pitcairn. I am John Pitcairn's great grandson, and that's kind of how I defined myself. I don't think that's necessarily unusual or unhealthy. I think that, to your point, I think finding individuality outside of those definitions is really important to transcend into adulthood. And I'll never forget, one of my psych professors said to me, I think the best definition of adulthood I've ever heard, and he said to me, my definition of being an adult is the ability to make decisions that are different than my parents would have made and feel good about it. And I think that a lot of that we carry as members of these families is, I know I have this responsibility and this relationship with the family, and I want to be able to steward that, but I also want to be able to find who I am in this journey of life. And I think it can be really, really challenging for people because I don't know that you can totally bifurcate it. I think it's just a part of who I am. It's a part that I've embraced and felt and feel very, very proud of, the history and the legacy and the good that the family has done. and I also wanted to find my way. And it took a while. I mean, I'm not afraid to tell you, I stumbled and took a while and tried to figure out who I am. And I'm still on that journey. I think, we don't end the journey of life until even when this life ends and the next life begins, we're on that journey of finding ourselves. So I'm probably not answering your question as succinctly as you would like, because I don't think it's separate issues. I think it's always part of who we are, or at least who I am. And I have, I have over the course of my life, luckily owned and operated 2 very small businesses outside Philadelphia. I've had the opportunity to make my own way as far as being able to make money and not just be an inheritor of wealth. And I think that feels really good. I think it goes to your question. When I felt like I was just an inheritor of wealth, that was one dynamic of my individuality. And when I became my own person, to be able to make my own money, make my own decisions, and say, I can do things on my own. They might not be to the magnitude of my great-grandfather, the founder of Pittsburgh Plate Glass, or maybe they will someday. But right now, the ability to forge my own way and feel good about it is, I think, incredibly empowering to individuality and to members of families like mine and me to feel good about doing something outside of the family system.
Well, you're explaining at a deeper level, and I really appreciate that, and I appreciate the authenticity as well, Andrew, of your own journey. Right, you may not be there yet, but it's that evolution constantly of finding yourself. And like you mentioned, there are these expectations, almost these unheard of expectations, like, well, you're not ABC person, right? And it's like, well, I don't want to be, right? It's the same thing with John D. Rockefeller. I don't want to be a John D. Rockefeller. I want to be James Rockefeller. I want to be my person and who I am and show up differently. And I wanted to talk about, because I had a friend of mine that's also a very wealthy individual like yourself, comes from a family, and the way they think about it is really not adding another comma to their net worth. They're looking more about, okay, hey, how am I going to leave my legacy in this world? And it may be, building out generational wealth, right? Maybe adding more businesses structure to it, or it might be more of like impact or influence, maybe political. We saw that in the Kennedy family, et cetera, right? And dynasty. And there's all sorts of different ways and trajectory. Andrew, now you're at this point, and you've obviously really established your identity, who you are. How do you like to show up, and what do you want to see your legacy as someone that's been able to say, okay, hey, I've been able to make an impact, and in this category, or you really focus on that ESG side of thing, and say, hey, you know what, I think there's underserved communities in other ways, or environmental issues. How do you see, and not just like you mentioned, adding another comma to your wealth in the family? Yes, that's part of it, but also it's like, hey, you know what? This is this is Andrew Pitcairn's legacy. How do you look at it?
Yeah, that's an extremely interesting question, and it's one, ironically, that I was traveling last week, and I was at the Columbia Business School's annual event up in New York, where I was keynoting on governing for the future, and I couldn't help but, as I was sitting there thinking about all these individuals in the room, these young entrepreneurs and these young family business owners, and I started thinking about myself, and I actually started thinking about the exact question you just asked me. What is it that I feel is me? If I think about Andrew Pitcairn, who am I, and what is my legacy going to be? What would I like it to be, and what maybe control do I have over it? And fortunately, I feel like, to your very good point, I am fairly entrepreneurial myself. I enjoy investing in things that I think make a difference, that you can give back to society, that you can make some wealth in, that you can give back, and that I can have fun doing. I also think that adds to exactly what you're saying, though. I think that the legacy that I would really like to have, is, I think, and I don't know if how this is going to sound coming out, but when I'm gone, if people could say, Andrew Pitcairn was a guy, I get a little choked up, that was my friend, and that I could call, and he would pick up the phone, and he would talk to me, and he would help me, and I could rely on him. I think for me, that would be the definition of success. I mean, that's what I certainly would look for, rather than saying, well, Andrew Pitcairn was a guy who made all this. I think it was a guy that said that here's a guy who stewarded his family's name in a way that was full of pride, a person who enjoyed life, and a person who I could count on. I think that would, to me, would probably encapsulate the whatever years I have in life. That would put a punctuation at the end of it that I would feel really, really good about. So I have to say this too, because I always say this. I'm a very emotionally driven person, and my wife and my 15-year-old daughter tease me all the time. They say, because if we're watching a movie, I'm usually the one that's having tears and crying watching the movie. And my wife coined a term. She said, Andrew, you have enough tears for all of us. And so I I just let it all kind of hang out, and that's the kind of person I am. I enjoy life, and Christian, I really appreciate your questions here, because I think it's getting to the root of what we're trying to accomplish as humans, as humanity, and get us past the point of just adding another comma. I love that saying, by the way, adding another comma. That's part of life's journey, because we live in a world where adding a comma allows us to do better, greater things for the common good, I think. But it certainly isn't, I don't think, is the ultimate or the end goal. It's part of a journey.
Well, Andrew, I appreciate you being authentic and just sharing your heart and wearing your heart on the sleeve and just showing up. I just, and that's really kind of very humbling to hear someone like yourself that's how you want to show up, and that's what your legacy wants to be. That's very honorable, and highly respect that. I want to talk a little bit about this. What I always find interesting is we always talk, and I've had a lot of individuals on where we talk about like different vehicles and instruments and trust and all the different ways to allocate wealth and all that fun stuff for generations. But what I've come to understand, it really comes down, and I think we all can agree that it comes down to mindset and human behavior, right? I think Dave Ramsey quotes this. It's like, hey, you know what? If you give someone money without knowledge, then you hurt them. But if you give them knowledge, they'll find the money. But if you give them both, all of a sudden they become unstoppable. And so we talk about money and wealth and steward and so forth, but then we never really talk about the mindset and really leading that next generation from a certain age. It's the same thing with like going to college, right? Why do we go to college? To learn and educate, and so that we can become performers in good parts of society, etc. It's the same thing that I look at with wealth, and that's how I'm thinking. For my generation, I don't have kids, but that's how I want to visualize creating an ecosystem where it's like, hey, we're sharing the community, the values, the this and that. And so I'm thinking generation 2, generation 3. But as you can understand, I would imagine, Andrew, that it becomes messy, right? The larger the organization becomes, the larger the family becomes, there's divorces, there's breakups, there's all sorts of, relational things, there's different personality types. It's running a business, but at just a macro level, and it's wealth, and you're all tied to this. And so I guess my question is this, is now that you've come this part, there's obviously certain things you've learned from your father to your grandfather and so forth. And one of the things is that you probably want to implement for the next generation, so that maybe you don't repeat certain mistakes or whatever those mistakes were. You could share with those or whatever. But what if things are you learning now that you would like to implement to carry on and make sure that wealth, and not just the wealth, but it's also these individuals that steward it, have the same perspective as you do? What does that look like, Andrew?
That's a great question, Christian. And I'll just back up by saying with this, the Pitcairn family today is a Generation 7 family. So I am Generation 4, but we go to Generation 7 right now, and we have, I believe at last kind of count. I don't think we're actually keeping a precise count because the family's gotten so large. But I think we're just about between 700 and 800 people in the family. So you're talking about a massive family. And one of the things that I will say that when families like ours get so large, I sometimes am asked, or actually frequently am asked, well, hey, Andrew, how have you guys managed to keep the family together all of this time? And the truth is that we haven't. I think as families grow, you have different wants and needs, and to your very good points, you have, divorces, you have people that just don't get along, you have different wealth structures, you have just so many different personalities that trying to keep hundreds and hundreds of people corralled in one place becomes detrimental. And I look back on, the stories that I was told back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s about wanting to keep the family together and wanting to keep everybody on the same page, got to a place where people felt like they were held hostage. They didn't have a say they didn't have autonomy. They didn't have a say in what they were doing with their investments or their philanthropic endeavors or just their day-to-day lives. And that created a lot of tension in our family system. And we had two, what I would, I like to call them liquidity events, but to be honest, they were two family splits. And they were done I think the right way, as best we could manage it. But in 1986 and in 1993, we had large contingents of the family say, you know what, we just want to do something different. And I think to the extent that you can sit back and try to understand where people are coming from and what's important to them, and for the best that you can, try to keep some sort of harmony and some sort of glue in the family that just keeps at least people steward and say, okay, we choose to disagree with certain things. How do we move forward? So I think you have to give people autonomy. You have to give people individuality to stay or to leave, and we've done that. One of the things I do want to get at, though, I think, which is maybe a little more to your question as I'm thinking this through, is I think to really instill a sense of purpose and integrity in people. How do you instill in people that they have a sense of themselves? We talked about this earlier on, but a sense of purpose and integrity. And I think those are values that we all would be well advised to pass down from generation to generation, because I just think that without that sense of purpose in life, it's really easy to flounder and really easy to find yourself in situations that aren't to your best benefit. And I think stewarding wealth is one thing, but being able to have respect and accountability towards oneself, to myself, about being the best person I can be, is finding a purpose beyond the wealth, beyond the comma. I'm going to keep using that, Christian, by the way. We don't need to add another comma. How do we have purpose outside of that? So I'm not sure I answered your question. I got off a little bit there, so tell me if that's helpful.
That is very helpful, and I'm glad you like the no comma. I got it from someone else there. Now I want to ask you a little bit this. So when I was in the Air Force, I remember going through this training, and in order to be called an airman, right, you had to do certain things for many weeks to be able to earn the right. And I thought that was interesting because and I instilled this, and I started looking at how these individuals, these generation. I'm glad you mentioned G7, Generation 7, and these huge ecosystems and the way you think about autonomy and so forth. But let me ask you, Andrew. I've talked to some individuals, and the way they think about, hey, because you're part of the family doesn't mean that you get access to the wealth yet. It's almost like it's an earned opportunity. It's almost like, you have to go through a college degree to get that degree, right? You have to go through the hard work. So it's not like, oh, I'm just born and boom, I'm part of the Pitcairn family, so I deserve this. Do you structure it where it's like, hey, yes, you're part of it, but there's certain things you have to do to earn it, right? And not in the concept of this metric-based system, but it's more of then they feel like, wow, I feel like it's mine. I went through the hard work. I did what was necessary. It's the same structure that when I had to work through all the crap to get to be an airman. I thought, oh wow, I took more responsibility of it. It was mine. It was the same thing with buying your first car. It's different than if someone just gives you a car. Just a different way of thinking about it. On the mindset and the paradigm. So I'm just curious how you guys structure that. Is it just, hey, you're part of the Pitcairn family, and naturally, there's certain ordinances and governance on how to structure that, or what is that? How do you navigate that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's not one dimensional. So if I think about the planning that was done generations ago by my grandfather and his siblings, and then my parents and such. There certainly are vehicles set up that when someone is born into the family, you're just part of the family, and there's no say that. For instance, I would say for my daughter, I don't have any say. Once she was born into my line of the family, she at an age will become of age and have access to a certain amount of those vehicles that have like trust structures and other things like that. I have no say in that because that was previously set up. There are, in the evolutionary thinking of passing down wealth and setting up wealth, it has changed and evolved over the years, as you may imagine. And certainly there are benefits to performance-based, like they call performance-based trusts, that you have to accomplish certain achievements in order to have access to things, not just an age bracket, but you actually have to do these things. And I believe that people within our, at the family, at our household level in the family have set those things up. I know that a lot of other families have set those up, trust for education, performance-based trust, not just the assumption per, I think what you're asking is, just because you're born into the family doesn't mean you're going to get all of this. You have to accomplish things, you have to earn things. And I think there's really interesting thoughts about on both sides of that. It's well, I'm going to encourage you to be productive, almost force, but encourage you to do these things that I want you to do. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that's one way to look at it. Another way is to say, well, by the time you're 40, I'm going to assume you're going to have found your way, gone through your schooling, and built a profession. So at 40 or 45 years old, that's going to be the triggering event that'll gain you access to a trust that I've set up. I think there's all kinds of ways to look at it. I think, though, what you're getting at, and what I'll just coin as two different words, the not wanting to be entitled to be privileged. So I think that when we talk about privilege in the world today, that it takes on some bad connotations. But in this context, I just want to say, I view living in America for many people as being privileged, right? Having access to clean water, having access to abundant food, having access to freedom, if you will. That's a privilege compared to a lot of other places. Just want to, with that as a backdrop, I'll say, if I think about myself and the eventual realization that I'm born into a privileged situation, doesn't mean that I have to be entitled. Doesn't mean that you owe it to me, or that you should give it to me, or because my last name is Pitcairn that I deserve this unequivocally. I don't believe that. I think that to many of our comments in our conversation over the past half an hour or so, what does it mean to raise responsible stewards? What does it mean to educate people? What does it mean to have a higher sense of purpose? And that helps, I think, people avoid the entitlement trap where I carry this last name, I'm owed this, I don't have to do anything, I can be as nasty as a person as I want, and I still can have all of these things. And you know what? For some people, Christian, that might be true. You can be any kind of person you want to be and still have access to your family's resources. I don't think that's going to make people happy. I don't think it's going to make them productive. And I don't think it's going to make them a successful contributor to the greater goods of society, if that's the way they're going to show up.
Well, that's why I respect this conversation so much, and respect you, Andrew, because the way you think about it, it comes in, you come across very humbly, and you see it so much bigger than just yourself, right? And you don't use the Pitcairn family name to self-promote your own. It comes with this humble stewardship, and that's why I think it's so interesting. And that's why I'm so intrigued. Like, where did that come from? When was that ingrained? Or did you come with some pride and arrogance and like, hey, you know what, I'm the Pitcairn, and then all of a sudden you had an experience of kind of your head hit the wall, someone maybe humbled you a little bit, and then you're like, okay, wait a minute, I have a responsibility. That's why I was asking, like, that structure of the humility that you bring to that generation 4, family office structure. So is that just innate, do you feel, or is that something that the humility has been part of this evolution and big part of your journey, Andrew?
No, Christian, that's a great question again, and I feel as we continue to talk here, it continues to evolve in my mind. And I know we were talking before about the innate, some people that are born with feeling a sense of pride and stewardship, and some people are taught that. I think for me, if I look back on my high school days and maybe early adulthood days, I think I would probably classify myself as someone who felt more entitled. That's someone who felt that, I lived in a small community. I started to realize that the family had wealth, and that maybe I didn't have to play by the same rules as other people. And I think I probably lived my life like that for a handful or two handfuls of years. I do remember, I shouldn't say waking up one day, but I think that really was how it was. And I said, I'm not liking who I'm seeing in the mirror. I don't like the way that I'm feeling. I don't like that I'm relying on the family. I don't like that I'm not progressing in a way that I feel like I should be as a young adult. And I think it was just that that ability somehow, and my mother played a big role in this. My mother, I think, and I had a heart-to-heart conversation in my early 20s, and she basically said to me, "You need to get your act together," and that was really difficult to hear, but she was right. And I think when I had to really look at myself, and I think this is what it takes. I think it takes the ability to look in the mirror, to have some introspection, and to be able to say, what kind of person do I want to be? And to your question earlier, if you can think ahead a little bit, what kind of legacy do I want to leave? How do I want to be remembered? How do I want how do I want to show up as a friend to people that I care about and to my family members? And it forced some change within me. That doesn't happen overnight. Change does not happen overnight. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of hard work. But everyone's capable of change. And so I think if I'm being really honest with you, I would say that I probably was an entitled teenager. Figured out I didn't want to be that person into my adulthood, and put in a lot of work to figure out how I can be of service to other people and not just myself.
Well, I appreciate that. I just love your authenticity and the way you have this conversation in regards to just how humility is a big part of it. And there was a point, and there was a pivot point, and then you like you mentioned, is an evolution. You mentioned, I want to look back on something that I found very interesting. There are stigmas for trust babies, right? And it's so interesting because it's a negative connotation. However, though, I think some of the greatest individuals that produce incredible businesses, they got loans from some of the their family. They were able to leverage some of their family's wealth to be able to bounce themselves into some bigger things. You look at Bill Gates' story. He took a large, substantial money. You look at even Phil Knight. He took a large, substantial money from his family as well. And the point is they built incredible empires with that. Correct, 100%. But they didn't do it alone. And so I think that's the same way that I look at with the trust babies, if you will, where it's like, hey, they're able to leverage some wealth, but then you have the Kennedy family where they're able to leverage their wealth to be able to get into politics and influence in a positive or negative way depending upon your political views. But my point is you actually have a very interesting way. One, I think it's really good to set the stage clear for a lot of the misconceptions around the negative connotation toward trust babies, trust families, and so forth. I'd love for you to just kind of give us a whole paradigm, how you guys think about it and how you guys structure that. Again, that responsibility, that steward, and it seems like that's the value and the ethos of the Pitcairn family.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. And I think those are really good points. And other families have done this well, not just the Pitcairn family. And I think, to your point, if the term trust fund baby, right, is one of those negative connotations out there where people say, oh, he's just a trust fund baby. And quite honestly, I think you reminded me, Christian, that I'm sure that was said about me, and I'm sure it was said about me to my face. And I remember feeling, it doesn't feel good when someone just says, oh, you're just a trust fund baby. It's like, whoa, that's how you view me. And that to me hit home. And I think that was part of the drivers where I said, you know what, I don't want to be looked at as just a trust fund baby. But to your very good points, how do families, Pitcairn family and other families of means, use those structures, that wealth to really to do the greater good? And I think, I've always viewed Pitcairn as being our family office and our family name, as being a source of stability, not just in our family, but as our name and it grew, and as our family office has grown. I felt very blessed to be part of a sustainable ecosystem that has done such wonderful things over the generations for my family and other families. And I think when I think about what we want to try to accomplish, it's entrepreneurship. That word comes to mind. How do we instill entrepreneurship? And entrepreneurs need access to all kinds of things, like you're saying. They need access to resource, they need access to capital, and blessedly, families that come from means can fund some of those things when appropriate through different structures like trusts or family banks or different things like that. But how do we instill entrepreneurship? How do we instill deep senses of integrity and purpose? And how do we view ourselves as this source of stability in an ever-changing world? And I think that's kind of what you're saying. How do we utilize these things, these family structures that we have, to really benefit the family members that ultimately now will benefit society, right? I always like to say this. the private sector, private business, family-owned business, private businesses, private sector have and always will solve the majority of the problems that we have in the world, from hunger to climate change to and beyond. All the kind of things that we're struggling with. Private sector has solved these and will continue to solve these. And we need to encourage entrepreneurship, and we need to encourage people to take risk, and we need to encourage people to find these purposes outside of themselves or that they're a part of and drive those passions. And so that we're not just worrying about the bottom line and growing wealth, but we're doing it in a way that is benefiting society. And when you talk about people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, other people who own a lot of companies and who have built companies, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, I mean, love them or hate them, they have created enormous amounts of wealth, not just for themselves, but for other individuals. They've created an unbelievable amount of jobs and workforce and comfort and reliability for other families, right? For other individuals. And people tend to forget that. They just look at, Elon Musk, or I shouldn't be using names maybe, but they just look at the wealth creator. They don't look at the massive amounts of good and change that they have pioneered by forming private sector businesses. I just think it's so important.
I'm so glad we're bringing that up a little bit, because there is a lot of just overall misunderstanding in regards to wealth, and there's like anti-capitalism movement a little bit, and I love that how you mentioned obviously the power of capitalism, how it does solve problems. Yes, do some people make a lot of money, but also with that comes with a lot of other individuals that make a lot of money as well. I know a lot of billionaires that made a lot of money just off of Mark Zuckerberg and his explosive growth with Facebook, and it's just so interesting to see. You see that with Amazon, all sorts of things. So I'm glad you brought that up. I want to talk and pivot slightly to governance. I'm not too familiar with establishing a ton of trust and stuff like that, but I have talked to a lot of family offices and the way they structure things. And they share with me a little bit of the operating cost, right? So there is this concept of, okay, hey, we got preservation of the wealth, right, for generations, but also we don't want to offset that with, increasing our operating cost. And like with any business, we see this in the tech world right now, and we see this with just in general. It's very easy to even we saw this with GM, many years back, where the profit was decreasing, right? The revenue was decreasing, but the expense just kept getting growing. We're seeing this in the government, actually. My point is, behind this, is how to make sure, because obviously you want to preserve the wealth, and you don't want to just take the wealth and just pivot toward operating cost. You want to obviously make sure that there is simplification, but obviously you want to make sure that there's also structured correctly. So how do you find that fine line? Definitely when you're having 800 individuals in your family now, generation 7, that simplification, you want to obviously preserve the wealth and grow it to some extent, but also making sure that it's, your operating expense is not, outgrowing your preservation and your growth of your wealth. How do you look at that and navigate that a little bit in regards to the governance side of things?
Yeah, that is a multifaceted question, Christian. And there's a saying, and hopefully I will pronounce this correctly. It's called the Malthusian effect, and that simplified states that you can grow the numbers in your family faster than you can ever grow the wealth. And that holds true for most families. Most families will procreate far faster than they can build the wealth. And that's kind of and so you look at that truth, by the way, that's a truth. And you say, okay, what can I do? What can I do to have a 50 or 100-year plan if I know the family is going to grow faster than the wealth? Well, the interesting side of that conversation is there's a saying in our industry, and it goes shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. And what that means is the first generation makes the wealth, the second generation enjoys the wealth, and by the third generation they've got to go start recreating the wealth because most of it's gone. And and that's actually true. That's true as well. The statistic is true. It's usually not because of poor investments or poor performance or family overspending. That's usually true because of lack of governance within a family structure, lack of families getting along, lack of effective decision making, lack of a common purpose, lack of family harmony, lack of cohesiveness when families fragment, and that tends to create such strain on wealth structures that it ends up getting spent. Maybe it's through the court systems, maybe people just spend it, down on things they shouldn't be spending on. But there's a lack of governance around the family being able to have constructive conversations. And what I like to say is with people say this all the time. I communicate very, very well. I'm always transparent with in my communications. And there's two things to that. Communication has two sides to a coin. It's talking and it's listening. And let me tell you this, we were given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. The one who's usually wrong is the one doing the most talking. So, you have to learn to listen to people. That's, I see you laughing. So listening is an art that we're just not taught. We'd rather talk. So that's one thing. How do we listen better and talk less? Number 2, transparency. People say all the time, I'm transparent. I shared with you the financials. I shared with you the estate plan. I shared with you my decisions that I'm going to make or have made. That's great. Transparency is not the same as inclusion. If you really want to have a relationship with people, you need to listen to what they're thinking, feeling, and desiring in their needs, and you need to be able to include them in productive decision making when it comes to things that will affect them and their loved ones. So you can be very inclusive and you can be very transparent and not inclusive at all. I would suggest that's not a fantastic way to have multi-generational success. You really need to be transparent, inclusive, and I think the inclusiveness, it works a lot better.
This is so a timely wisdom, regardless. I just think it's so incredible. So one, of course, listening instead of just sitting there talking. And I think there's huge wisdom in that. And then as well as the transparency. And I just think that's a really, really good differentiation. You want to make sure you have both there to really make sure that, okay, hey, inclusion as well as transparency, that's how you make that alignment and ensure that everybody's on that same page. When you're talking a little bit more about that communication style, you mentioned obviously you get to this macro level, right? 800 individuals. I always like to gravitate toward business just because it's the same thing. I look at Amazon and the complexity of that, but he's very focused on making small groups. That the 2 pizza roll, if you will, 12, 15 people. And creating that community and synergistic thing and creating ideas out of that. What I always find interesting is kind of allocating that or comparing that to the family as well, because I think we've all come to the point where it's like, okay, we see these big families come together, and I've come to my own family reunions, but it's almost like everybody kind of still sticks with their own family, even within the family reunion. So it's not like we're actually building a synergistic thing and building morale and whatever. Again, you have to be intentional, right? Intentional communication, so forth. So with the word intentional, what are certain things maybe you do, or maybe just you want to integrate into your family to be intentional with communication, transparency, and inclusion?
Sure, that's a great question, and I'm gonna, Christian, if it's okay with you, I'm gonna personalize that a little more when it comes to my distinct household. So my wife and our 15-year-old daughter, and I'm happy to elaborate on this when it comes to our family office. But just for that question, let me concentrate on my wife and daughter. And with someone with a 15-year-old daughter, you can imagine, what are the conversations that we have? What are the age-appropriate conversations that we have? How do we have dialogues around wealth and the family and the family history? And it's funny. Literally the other week, I was driving my daughter to school, and she goes to school in this little town called Bernathen that I referenced early in the conversation. She had said to me, Dad, a couple of the kids had said something to me around being a Pitcairn. And I said, interesting. I said, okay, can you share that with me? And I said, was it negative or was it positive or was it just a comment? Because there's different ways that people say things, honey. And she said, no, it was just kind of a comment, but it made me start thinking. And I just had some questions. And she just started asking me about the family and different things, about some of the family estates and Bernathen and great-grandfather. And these are things, by the way, I should back up and say, ever since she was a little in single digits, I would tell her stories, bedtime stories. Most people tell bedtime stories when they read books, and we did those too. But I would tell her bedtime stories, and I would be sure to include stories about great-granddad coming over from Scotland and working on the railroad, and what it took to be an entrepreneur, and the sacrifices that he made early on, and the unbelievable amount of thought and giving that he had to be able to, for our family to celebrate 7 generations of sustainability is extremely humbling. And I just feel so blessed to be part of the family, and that someone took the time to think about me, my cousins, my child. It's unbelievably humbling. And so I was talking to her about all that. I was talking to her about that when she was single digits, but now that she's a teenager, and she's going through some of the things probably that I felt as a teenager. And we have a relationship where she can come to me and my wife, and we can talk about anything. And I think this may be an evolution in society. I know I didn't feel that way necessarily with my parents. I didn't feel, and maybe that was just me, I'm not placing blame here. I didn't feel that I could go to our parents. It was just a different era. It was a different time. It was a different way of parenting, probably. And so I can see that and understand that. My wife and I have really cultivated with our daughter that no matter what you're feeling or thinking or hear, you can come and talk to us about it, and we'll talk to you about it. And so she ends up asking us all kinds of questions about not just my family, but my wife's family and my father, who passed away many, many years ago. And I think I'm probably rambling a little bit. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I think to the extent that we can have dialogue and just in an open platform with especially our kids at a young age, to be able to steward them in a way that they feel good about themselves and feel like they are in a place that's of trust and a place of comfort. I think you lay a platform and you lay a foundation for them to be successful, because there's nothing they can't accomplish. There's nothing that is off limits. There's nothing that they should be ashamed of. They should feel. I'm a big believer that if you instill that gratitude in people, I shouldn't say instill, but if you cultivate that gratitude in people, it really helps them find their own identity. So I'll pause there. Sorry for the long-winded ramble.
Don't at all apologize. And I love the word cultivate. I think that's just so beautiful, because, see, again, a lot of parents, what I've noticed, a lot of families, is they tend to gravitate away from talking about politics, religion, or money, right? Those big 3, right? Don't ever talk about that. We're just going to talk about how the weather is in the day, whatever, very generic stuff. But you're cultivating, you be intentional with this conversation. Say, hey, this is our family history. This is the way to think about it. This is the steward. And you obviously cultivate, I love that word, cultivating that at a very young age, and bringing it very intentional with having that dialogue, having that conversation, so that when she does come of age, at this point where, okay, hey, now she has that same, very similar perspective on the way, obviously, to look at the family and the wealth and the generation. Andrew, you also mentioned you guys think more of 50-year, 100-year timelines. And what's so interesting to me is majority of middle class, I would say almost 90% of individuals, in the world, they focus on short-term thinking. And it's very difficult. Even if they think long-term, they may be 10 years. And it's hard to think, wow, 50 years, 100 years, what does that look like? If you're 30 years old, that's 7 years old, at that. So this huge timeline, but that's how you have to think, because that's obviously the trajectory of your family. What does that methodology or process look like for you? Maybe putting out goals, maybe putting out dreams, maybe putting out, visions, or the structure of it. How do you think about that in those kind of, larger time frames?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't remember who said this, and I'm probably going to represent this saying, but it says something like, most people think they can accomplish too much in a year and not enough in 20. And I think that's a big challenge. Everyone sets these goals, these big lofty goals, and they don't realize lots of things take a long time, and it's a constant evolution, and it's a constant, how do you change and evolve with your circumstance, and how do you pivot? And if I think about our family and our family's evolution, maybe this is helpful, is, great-grandfather founding Pittsburgh Plate Glass in 1883. Fantastic. Creating, substantial wealth for the family. His 3 sons coming together in 1923 and creating the Pitcairn Family Office, and running the Pitcairn Family Office for just the Pitcairn family for 64 years until 1986. In 1986, we liquidated out of Pittsburgh Plate Glass, believe it or not. I mean, that was a big event for the family. It was, our family company, legacy company, but we needed to diversify for many, many reasons out of PPG. So we ended up saying, you know what, we're an entrepreneurial family, very entrepreneurial. We want to continue to cultivate entrepreneurship, and we want to continue that legacy of entrepreneurism. And so we opened up our doors from a single family office for just the Pitcairn family to a multifamily office and Pennsylvania Charter Trust Company that is our operating company today. And that is a direct example of how do you pivot and how do you evolve with the times. And so in 1987, when we turned to a multifamily office, we had one client, the Pitcairn family. Today, we represent about 125 other ultra-high net worth families and about 30 other single-family offices that we do what we like to call true family office services for them. We are one of the very few real family offices, what I would say that is a boutique family office. So I think to your example, how do you evolve over the years? How do you continue to be a thought leader? How do you think, what is the next, if I want to go there, and I know it's going to take me 10 or 20 years, what's there going to look like? And being able to pivot and move. And I'll give you one other example that I think is interesting. If I think back to the pandemic, excuse me, all of a sudden the world came to a grinding halt in March of 2020. And you think about, just as one example, you think about rideshare. Think about rideshares, Ubers and Lyfts and any rideshare platform that all of a sudden you had this infrastructure, but you had no clients. You had drivers, but you had no one getting in cars. They pivoted pretty quickly. Those drivers probably said to themselves, we can deliver food, we can deliver goods, we can deliver almost anything because we have infrastructure. And I think it takes entrepreneurial thinking like that and to think through, well, we have something built already. We have this family office platform. How do we utilize that? How do we structure all these things for our family for generations? And how do we help other families think about that? It's such a rewarding concept to think, things aren't going to end next year. In fact, they're not going to end we don't know when they're going to end because I should mention this too. 1923, we founded our family office. Today's 2023. This is our centennial year. We're 100 years as a family office, and we're looking at the next 100 years. And so I hope that's kind of answering your question. I get so excited when I think, man, we're thinking about the next 100 years. What does this look like beyond today, beyond tomorrow? And for my daughter and her kids, what does Pitcairn look like? And I hope other families can take something from that and say, I can do that. Whether it's your family found pizza shop or whether it's your car dealership or whether it's your Fortune 500 company, it doesn't matter. You are an entrepreneur giving back to society and making a difference in the private sector. And I just want to give a shout out that I hope that people are taking pride in what they're doing.
Well, it's that DNA of that entrepreneurial spirit that is ingrained into every single one of the Pitcairn family. And I just think you mentioned that throughout our whole conversation. I just think that's so incredible because, like you said, that you have to rely on that next generation to keep, sustaining and thinking that. Incredible, Andrew. I really appreciate your time. Just the humility, the authenticity, the way you think about this, the responsibility, the stewardship. I just think it's so important for myself and my audience as well to understand, for those that have generated wealth, but also really think about generation 2 and generation 3. And you're already there, generation 4 to generation 7 now. And we could learn so much from people like yourself that are already navigating these waters and how to think about that. So I really appreciate you looking back and sharing it with my audience and myself and being on here. Andrew, for those that want to, maybe consume and listen to more of what you got going, I know you speak all over the place. I know you've got a ton of content out there as well. How do they reach out and follow more about what you got going on, Andrew?
No, absolutely. Thanks for that. You can always look at our website. It's www.pitcairn.com. I'm on LinkedIn as well. You can find me there. And if you look at our website, there's ways to get a hold of anybody in our firm, myself included. And so I would encourage you to do that. And I really appreciate the opportunity, Christian, to come on and speak with you and you reaching out to me and just I feel very blessed that you've included me here today, and I hope that your audience has some nuggets they take away from this and just realize that life is for the grabbing. Go get it and find yourself and make a difference in the world, make a difference for yourself. It's a blessing. So thank you.
Thank you, and that's timely wisdom. I love that. I love that. Go get it for yourself and make a difference in the world, guys. That is the Board of Directors and Governance Chair of the Pitcairn Family Council, the one and only Andrew D. Pitcairn. Guys, that is Journey with Christian Evans podcast. Until next time, be uncommon if you can.